thing that you notice when I was reading about the Chinese cities, that the initial ones, anyway, in the new dispensation, they didn't have the big parks and they didn't put that stuff in. I think they're doing it now. Is that right?
Oh yes, now I mean, if you go to Shenzhen
Mm.
or the new model cities of China, they are much more beautiful than our cities in many ways. They're just filled with greenery, and soon they will have cities which I've seen models of them where the whole thing, if you look down on them, would be a park. I mean, basically the
Mm.
rooftops are filled with gardens, and then
Yeah.
and you go underground. So basically, they will no longer have traffic in them, and you'll basically be living in a park with some buildings. So they move very rapidly to our model. But if you went there, as I went and others went, or to Japanese to a large extent, though they had miniaturized gardens, and certainly to Indian cities, and though they had some parks. Basically, the idea was the city was the city. The land was too valuable to build and to leave. And the idea of the private garden, the front garden, the lawn, the back garden. I mean, some estate developer in China a few centuries or a few, tens of years ago, looking down on a map of London and seeing all that wasted space, you probably live in such a house, I don't know. You have a house in
Yeah.
London, and behind it or in front of it, you have, a place where you could build another house, a garden. Think of the opportunity cost of your vegetables and flowers in that garden. So the English love of sort of a little garden space, and their love of parks and trees inside the road, all that is mixing. But the other effect is that if you went to a village or a town in England in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, you would find that they were urban by the American definition. The things they talked about, their concepts of time, their concepts of space, were urban. And it's something that Tocqueville, as ever, noted in America. He said one of the extraordinary things as a Frenchman, if in France you go out of Paris and you go to your country estate in Normandy and you go into a peasant home and so on, it's a different world. There's nothing to talk about, and everything they believe in, and the furniture and everything is different from my urban world. He said, when I go to the backwoods of America, if I go to some remote farm in wherever it is, and I go into a house, I might as well be in New York. They have the newspapers there. They've they got the latest news. They want to talk about the latest politics. They're thinking in monetary terms and money values. Time is money. They might as well. And it's a point. I mean, it was in the basic work of Weber again, because Weber, in another of his wonderful ideas, was his realization that urbanism and capitalism are related, and as a spirit, they are not related to the material externals. So you can have, and he took as his famous example Benjamin Franklin. Now, Benjamin Franklin, wherever he was an urban, modern, capitalist, Puritan ethic sort of person. And Weber said, if you, capitalism, urbanism, modernity is not to do with the surroundings. He said, you can go to 15th century Florence or Venice, and it is filled with the trappings of capitalism, trade, money, markets, all that stuff, but it's pre-capitalist. It doesn't have the spirit of endless accumulation, cost accounting. All this spirit is absent. You can go to the most remote part of America with Benjamin Franklin, and there they are behaving like proto-absolute capitalists. And it was the same with England. And one of the reasons I think England industrialized and became a capitalist, the first capitalist industrial nation, is that it was already, if you went to my village in a remote fen in the 14th, 15th century, from Cambridge to here, you would have met people who you could talk to. You'd have met And I remember, just a last graphic example, when I came to this village, which is 5 miles from Cambridge. When I first came here, I was the first outsider. I mean, there've been lots of outsiders. I was the first academic living in Load. And when we came in, we were next to a little cottage. Ours, a little cottage. The next cottage was Ted and Ida Golding, and they'd been living there since the First World War. They were quite old, and they'd been rearing cattle in the fen, and they had pigs in the backyard, and they were peasants. Anyone would have thought they were peasants. And I remember going in, and they had very simple furniture and so on, going in, and Ted saying, would you like a glass of sherry? And he took out a glass of sherry, and then he said, you know, what do you think of the chances of the Labour Party getting in this time? And there was all the fen farming folklore and even some witchcraft and all stuff round it, but they were basically urban, modern. And the example you can see is if you go to a French rural museum, the great one which I've been to near Paris, the Musée des Arts Populaires, or whatever it is, wonderful museum. And you just step into that museum and you're in a different world. Everything, the recreations of life there and the artifacts, you are in a peasant civilization. If you come to the Cambridge Folk Museum, as it's laughingly called, there's nothing folkish about it. It's basically filled, and this I'm being a bit unkind, but with the bric-a-brac of the lower middle class of England. It's basically filled with simpler objects, often created through the industrial processes over the 18th and 19th century. So it's filled with older things and simpler things, but they are on a continuum with what you would have in the high culture. So there is no difference.
Right.
Away, with putting it in another terms, Peter Burke, the social historian, often talks about the difference between the high culture and the popular culture, which is a very strong distinction across Europe and in India and elsewhere. So in England, the distinction is very weak. And this leads to the fact that my friend Peter Laslett used to moan about. He said, well, why don't we have good folk museums in Britain? And I said, Peter, because we don't have folk.
Yeah.
We don't have a peasantry to produce the objects to fill them with. They do. So basically, it's been one of the themes of my work, like Origins of English Individualism. Peasant is a French word. We don't have peasants here. We don't have a different social structure in the countryside from the towns. And so to go back to the last example, in the village I studied for many years with Sarah, if you looked at the people who were there, they were often London merchants. They were people who had made money in the city and then come and lived there. Or they were people who'd made money in Norwich. And the place was filled with buying and selling and markets. And there was really, it was all on a continuum. And the fact that you can go to wonderful villages in East Anglia and the Cotswolds and see the retained 14th, 15th century houses of wealthy merchants and villagers. And that is because they were really no different from the ones who were living in slightly bigger places like Norwich or Ely.